Hello, everybody. I hope you are doing well. In this episode, I have a special guest. My guest is Aristotle Papanikolaou. He is a professor of theology at Fordham University. He holds the Archbishop Dimitrios Chair in Orthodox Theology and Culture and is the co-director of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center. Some of you may be thinking, Angelo, what are you doing bringing on a Orthodox theologian onto the Hearth of Hellenism podcast? Aren't you a polytheist? What's going on, you might be thinking. Well, yes, listener, that would be a good question if you have been following my work over the past several years and my interests in polytheism and Greek religion. But don't forget that Hearth of Hellenism is a place for Greek history, culture, religion, both ancient and modern, and everything in between. So yes, I do want to make space and carve out some time to include topics that pertain to the Orthodox religion, that is the predominant religion of Greek people today, the history of Orthodox Christianity and Eastern Roman empires. Those sorts of topics do interest me because it overlaps with Hellenism on many areas. So yes, there will be some discussion such as orthodoxy. The conversation is also not purely religious. It really hinges on current affairs and politics and the overlap and intersectionality with religion. These are things that I'm interested in. I'm not just interested in ancient history. I am interested in politics and how religion it interacts with politics. I'm very proud of this episode because for me, this episode is a good example of the uniqueness that I want my work to be. The Hearth of Hellenism is something that is not just ancient, it's not just polytheism. I want to demonstrate what Hellenism is for me, and that is everything Greek. Before we jump into the episode, I do want to make a quick note and acknowledge that I think that my audio in this interview is not the best. I do have a really good microphone. It is a Blue Yeti microphone, and my audio does come out well when I'm doing the solo recording, such as these podcast introductions. However, for some reason, when I'm on Zoom doing the interviews, it's not recording that well. I don't know if it's because the microphone might not be close enough to me to capture my voice clearly. I'm going to be more mindful of this on future episodes, how close the microphone is. I think it's that. So I just want to make that known that I do know that my audio is a little bit in the interview at some points. So if you have trouble understanding some of the stuff that I'm saying, I do apologize. I'm working on it. Enjoy. All right, Telly, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. How are you doing?
Very good, thank you.
Awesome. So the reason this interview is happening is because of a tweet. So let's start with that tweet that from August. There was a tweet concerning the Hungarians celebrating the feast of Saint Stephen, and over the parliament they had drones that made the sign of the cross over there, and the poster was saying, like, giving accolades to this and saying you would never see this in the United States on July 4th.
Right.
So, and you retweeted that. This is how it caught my attention. And you wrote, translation, we really need more dictators who kill journalists, oppress the opposition, rig the courts, outlaw homosexuality, etc., all in the name of a, quote, Christian culture that's right. That's really living not by lies. So right. that caught my attention because this is something we have in common, where we don't want to live in a Christo-fascist theocratic state.
Right.
And this is how I also found your work, your book, Mystical as the Political, right. Non-Radical Orthodoxy and Democracy.
Right. So a couple things there. It's important to realize who wrote that sort of tweet that praised the cross, being portrayed via the drones and all that. A guy named Rod Dreher, and he was trying to, praise how it is that Hungary as a state, as a government, as a state, can so visibly symbolize itself as a Christian nation. And while the U.S. used to do that, it has somehow lost that particular kind of character or form. And he wrote this book, Live Not by Lies, where he basically thinks that we are on the verge of a kind of liberal totalitarianism. Look, I mean, it's not let me just be clear. It is not the case that to have a thriving liberal democracy that you need to exclude religious symbols. I don't think that that is the case. So I want to be clear about that.
Mhm.
And you have thriving liberal democracies where religious symbols are portrayed. And even you have thriving liberal democracies, I think, where even certain religions are given a certain kind of priority or even a certain established status within the constitution. So,
Like
for
in
example,
Greece.
yeah, I would say Greece. Greece, I mean, the Orthodox Church is the established religion. The Orthodox Church is a very powerful institution. 90% of the Greeks still identify as Orthodox, even if they don't go to church or it doesn't really mean much to them, they still identify. Those are all complicated issues, but I think Greece has its problems with minorities, but I don't think it's on the verge of a kind of authoritarianism that we see in Hungary. I mean, I
Mhm.
think in Hungary we
Yeah.
see an authoritarianism, and so the thing that I wanted to communicate was that not that we can't have religious symbols, and I think like even in the United States, if we have a pluralistic democracy, it's not that we can't show like the Christmas scene outside the outside the local city hall. It's just that you need to also show other religious scenes. you
Yeah.
know, you can't just show the one religious scene because that's the problem. You don't want the state here in the United States anyway because we're so pluralistic
Yeah.
to give that kind of priority. So it's not that's not the problem per se. The issue is that this guy Dreyer is contrasting Hungary with the United States, and there's an irony because he's basically trying to counter totalitarianism, or supposedly he's against totalitarianism, and he's praising a totalitarian state.
Yeah.
He's praising a totalitarian ruler, and he knows as much as well because it's yeah, sure he was voted in by a democracy, but it's also very clear that he has squashed the opposition. He's taken over all the state media. He's controlled the legislature, the courts, all kinds of things that obviously authoritarians do on their way towards becoming authoritarians, right? So let's be clear. Again, just to kind of conclude this part, religious symbols are okay in a thriving democracy as long as it's pluralistic and it's equal. And many political philosophers actually have that view. I think the French situation is not good. Right now, they're trying to ban Muslim, not simply the headdress, but something called the abaya, the actual long robe that women wear outside, and that to me doesn't make any sense. Um, but you just can't sit there and praise Hungary for putting up the cross and saying it's a Christian nation when in fact we know that the guy's acting like a ruthless dictator. So I just don't think that that makes any sense.
Yes. Agreed. Now, with your work now, so this is the interesting thing. So I found your book interesting because it tries to address the issue of orthodoxy and these political issues. And
Yeah.
so maybe we should explain to the audience some of the current political issues going on within orthodoxy in terms of either like right-wing authoritarianism, support for liberal democracies, the different branches of orthodoxy,
Right.
where these things fall, and what is the current discourse, or what are the prominent narratives that are being circulated currently.
Um, in the U.S.,
We could do
or
the U.S. or wherever you think it's appropriate. Like in my case, I've had experiences with American convert to Russian Orthodoxy.
right, okay,
Us battling it out, and I saw a little bit of it
right,
myself.
right.
So maybe that's a good starting point.
Well, I mean, I think in the Orthodox world in particular, So it's very important for your listeners to realize that in the Orthodox world, only since the 1990s have we been in a space where all the Orthodox churches have to negotiate what it means to live in a liberal democracy. Prior to that, and we're only talking like 30 years ago, prior to that, the Orthodox, most of the Orthodox world had to really negotiate or contend with either friendly or hostile empires.
Hmm.
If we think of the Soviet Union as a kind of empire, right?
Hmm.
Or communist regimes, right?
Yeah.
So we'll say empires and or regimes. So it's significant that, we're 30 years into it and we're still, which isn't a long time, and we're still trying to make sense of it. I will say in the Orthodox world broadly, it's complicated in the sense that you don't really have, I think, a very broad sentiment against democracy. But what you see is a kind of picking and choosing of what they want to keep and what they think is somehow what they want. This kind of east-west tension. In other words, the kind of
Yes.
democratic principles that they want to keep, but then the kind of things that they want to basically distance themselves from Europe. And so part of that has to do with, for the most part, these things that are being called now traditional values. And so there's a sense in which, people want to keep the voting and the right to vote and different parties and different things like that. But in the end, they don't want to become like Europe in the sense of what they think is a purely secularized country or nation that allows various kinds of social um, norms to flourish, such as abortion or gay marriage or things like that. And that's where they're. I think that's where that's kind of the common bond, I think, with Orthodox all over the world, even the United States, right? Because those in the United States, it's very interesting the rhetoric they use. And of course, you should have Sarah Riccardi Schwartz on your show because she has this book Between Heaven and Russia, where she talks about converts to Orthodoxy who basically love Russia, they love Putin, they think Putin's the savior, and so on and so forth. So I think but even amongst that crowd, it's not that they're trying to they're not trying to reject America. They think America needs saving,
Hmm.
and it needs saving in the sense that it should be a democratic country, sure, but one with very thick sense of moral norms to it.
Yeah. I
Um,
want Christian values imposed.
right, certain kinds, not all of them, certain
Yeah.
kinds.
Not helping the poor, but taking
Correct.
rights away.
Certain kinds of certain ones, right? And Greece is very interesting too because Greece has moved in the direction of adopting almost certain abortion is legal in Greece, right?
Yeah.
And obviously they have civil unions, which is like
And
Germany.
there might
Germany,
be.
Germany technically does not have gay marriage per
Oh,
se as
okay.
civil unions. I'm pretty sure about that. If there's like a map of which ones, which European states have actually marriage and others that have civil unions, I think Germany is still calling it civil unions.
Hmm.
Um, so Greece is not necessarily out of the norm in doing
Yeah.
that.
And
And
we
so
might have our first gay prime minister in Greece.
I saw that, and but not only that, but there are shows in Greece. I mean, this really popular show Maestro in Blue. It's really quite remarkable the way they're depicting two young boys in a way that I don't even think you see that on American television, quite honestly. That level of intimacy, that level of depth. You might see it in American movies, but I'm not really sure you see it in American television all that much. Um, so I think Greece is a complicated place, but it's not.
Yeah.
The church has lost the cultural wars there. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Even though what's fascinating is they still remain a very powerful force. So in Greece, I think in the Orthodox world in general, I would say democracy. There is lip service to democracy. It depends on which part.
Yeah.
The democratic institutions and structures are stronger or weaker depending on which part of the Orthodox world you're in. But in general, there's a general vibe of like, we need to, I don't know, re-Christianize or have this kind of have these traditional values come into place. But that's not all Orthodox Christians think that way. I mean, I'm one of them, and I'm trying to, me and many others of us who are trying to articulate a different, like Pandalikalatzidis in Greece, we're trying to articulate, I think, a different kind of vision.
Interesting. And it's funny, it's interesting we're having a conversation because I'm sort of on the same page, with you, but from a different religious philosophical background as a polytheist. So I really want to have this conversation because there is common ground here, because I feel like in my experiences with the Greek polytheists in Greece, there's a lot of tension and conflict with the Greek society at large, and I would like to try and forge connections with commonalities and where we have overlaps of common goals. So this is a common goal, I think.
Yeah, and that's the way a thriving that and that's the way really a thriving democracy should function, in the sense that there's a very famous Harvard political philosopher, he's since passed away, named John Rawls, and he sort of calls it the overlapping consensus. So rather than having sort of the religion define what everybody should agree on, you need some kind of a consensus for a functioning society.
Yeah.
And I think like people can agree on freedom and equality as a kind of minimal standard, but they can agree with it. They can agree on it for different reasons, right? So you as a polytheist, me as an Orthodox Christian, a Muslim, right? We could kind of come together and say, right, freedom and equality, that works. I don't necessarily agree with you on everything, but I can agree with you on this much. But we would do it from some different metaphysical places.
Yes.
And that's okay. I mean that's okay. That's what makes things work. So
Yes. So now, with that being said, I feel that some people who are listening to this, who are either probably ex-Christians, people who left the church, whatever denomination they were, they've left because they didn't like certain qualities of Christianity. They didn't like the history of Christianity. This is something I'm always very interested in, the early, late antiquity, Byzantine history, and how the religion and the empire came together. And it seems that one could make the argument, and I think many do make that argument on like the right side, the side that's against the West, is that orthodoxy, Christianity, is inherently on the side of monarchy, of empire, of authoritarianism, all those sorts of things. So what would you say to that? How do we approach that?
I mean, I personally don't think, I don't think there's any religious tradition that's inherently this or that. I think that they have long histories of certain kinds of affiliations with political regimes. And it happens to be the case that, the Orthodox world, for the most part, since the 1990s, has had a certain kind of relationship with monarchical or authoritarian kinds of regimes, and only since the 1990s, as I've said, have they been trying to negotiate democratic norms and what that really entails for them in terms of being committed to it. I would say that the Catholic world, it was only up to the 1950s and 1960s. It was from the 1950s and 60s that they actually started to embrace fully modern democracy, and now that's become sort of the official norm for the Catholic Church. So, look, theologically, theoretically, within the tradition itself, I think there are deep theological resources for making the claim that Orthodox should fully embrace a democratic pluralism. I think that's what I'm trying to do. But also there are people in Islam trying to do that. I think there are people in Buddhist and Hindu traditions and Jewish traditions also who kind of want to, you basically think theologically, like, if this is really the core of my tradition, like where does it lead, right? So, I mean, 1,000 years ago, it would have been kind of unthinkable for someone to think about it to think of their tradition in terms of democratic norms, because that wasn't really the norm back then. That really wasn't sort of thinking in terms of democratic pluralism really wasn't the thing that gained steam, and neither were the conditions ripe for it. You have Orthodox like John Chrysostom who rail against democracy, but he's not really railing against liberal democratic structures like executive power, legislative power, things like that. He's railing against sort of the irrationality of the masses when they decide to vote for something that doesn't seem to make any sense. And I also think he's right about that. In other words, the kind of democracy that we support is not necessarily a majoritarian democracy or the kind of democracy that talks about voting. It's really a democracy committed to freedom and equality for all people. And we're still kind of hashing that out, what that means, and still debating it, because some people think it means economic equality and other people don't. We're still making sense of it. Some people thought at one time that it didn't have to mean that women voted, but now it would be hard to imagine a democratic structure society where women didn't vote, right?
Yeah.
So I think, again, in the 1990s, the Orthodox world had to negotiate it for the first time. And I think since the 1990s, we're still in that debate. And there are some of us trying to convince others that this is not in contradiction to our tradition. In fact, it's what our tradition really demands theologically, if these are the core elements of our tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And just because it wasn't this way in history isn't a good argument.
Yeah.
That's, I think, what we're all trying to claim, that history should not necessarily determine how we think about the present and the future.
Yes.
Our theology should. And I think most people would be on board, except now to be a democratic pluralistic state means to accept certain kinds of freedoms.
Mm-hmm.
Some people think are antithetical to being Orthodox.
Yeah, so the fight for human rights, equality, these are certain things that then people will say, well, this goes against the religion. Again, like, oh, well, I'm gay. I would like, I'm happy that I live in a country that provides me the opportunity and the right to get married. But some people, I guess, would take religion and say, well, no, you shouldn't have that right, because they, and they'll use the religion to, give their justification. How would we harmonize that nowadays? What would you?
that's exactly where that's where the religion has the hard part. It really does. I mean, that's where in the United States, and it's different for every country. In the United States, that's where the Orthodox Church as an institution has a hard time, and not just the Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church as well, has a hard time saying, okay, within our particular religious space, this is how we think about things. But when I react to the political space, what is it as an institution that I should promote? And it feels like a contradiction, like, within my religious space, it seems that this doesn't, we don't allow this. So how can I allow it over there? Right. But that's the trick. The trick is to understand that in order to support a flourishing democratic pluralism, they're going to have to accept certain things to be allowed in a political space that they don't allow within their own religious space. I mean, let's move beyond even the sexuality issue. I mean, technically within the religious space, they don't allow, let's say, premarital sex, right? Do they really want to outlaw in the political space premarital sex? I mean, does that make any sense at all? I mean, at one time it was outlawed. I don't know if we want to go back to that kind of example. So that's the hard part. And then let's say in places like Greece and Serbia and other places like that, then there's an added element to it, right? There's sort of the religious and ethnic identity thing.
Yeah.
The churches, and I think this is a bad move on their part. The churches start to play up kind of how to be Greek or Serbian means to be Orthodox. And if we accept these rules and norms, we're moving away from our true identity and all this other kind of rhetoric, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
So then it gets really complicated there in terms of how the church reacts. It almost feels like a defensive reaction. It feels like, they don't really have any good arguments for why there shouldn't be allowed in a democratic
Yeah.
pluralism, except for this religious and ethnic identity thing. And then in Russia, what you have emerging there is a complete religious nationalism where Putin is completely co-opting the church for geopolitical purposes. I mean, he's really carving out a Russia that is geopolitically different than Europe, especially when it comes to traditional values, right? So for him, it's totally being used as a tool to, and then some of the other countries are like, they're like schizophrenic because they're like, no, we need Europe for economic, and they do. We
Yeah.
want Europe for because we know that economically we're going to be better off with Europe, but we like what Russia's doing on this whole traditional values thing. So they're like, they don't know which way to support, and or they're trying to support both at the same time, which is now the Ukraine war has made much more difficult. So, but that's you've pointed. I think you've pointed out the heart of the problem is how it is that this institution can feel that it's being consistent with itself when within its own religious space it maintains a certain tradition, but then to support democratic pluralism, it's going to need to accept that things can happen in this democratic pluralist space that can happen in their own religious space. And even if we go something like gay marriage or civil unions, to me, it doesn't make any sense for the church to be against this in public space because ultimately what they're against is what the state considers simply a contract, right?
Yeah.
A contractual relationship. And why should the church, in the end, be against something which is to some extent within the state parameters, just a contractual relationships,
Yeah.
a contractual relationship? And the church is it's in contradiction because for let's say hetero political marriages, right, or political civil unions, sure, the church doesn't accept them, but they're not on the streets fighting against it.
Yeah.
So
So that might be
it
sort of
doesn't really make any
illogical.
yeah, it doesn't really make any sense that in terms
Yeah.
of other kinds of contractual arrangements that it
Yeah.
would,
Do you think it's more of a, well, they fear that that is bringing up sin into society. So now and they're gonna, God's gonna punish the nation. We had that over here too with like Pat Robinson. Every time there was a
yeah.
disaster, it's like, oh, it's because of the gays, or something like that. Like that's why the hurricane came or something.
Right. Yeah, I think no, well, they see that's the thing because none of I think there's not, I don't think there's a single Orthodox church in the world that says that they're against democracy. I mean, Russia's on the verge of that, I think, but they still haven't quite said that they're against democracy.
Mhm.
Um, Now, Russia doesn't look very democratic, and neither does Hungary. But no, I think that their claim is that when it comes to kind of the moral texture of a society, that it's not in contradiction to both support democracy and at the same time restrict certain kinds of practices or relationships
Mhm.
and I think that's and in the broad political philosophy debate there is there's a book by Cecile Laborde who is called the liberalism's religion, and she does make the claim that look, liberal democracy can look different in different places. And as an example, she says it's not necessarily against liberal democratic norms to restrict abortion. She'll say it's not necessarily against it. Um, so there, liberal democracy can look different. Can look different. I guess I just would make the argument that the church doesn't really have a good argument about why it should be rejecting certain kinds of things like certain kinds of contractual relationship, because the argument they do use is that it's not good for society. But that there's no empirical evidence for that at all. In fact, it's the opposite. Um, in the Greek space, it's a little different. I think that they use the argument that it's against our longstanding tradition of what it means to be Greek Orthodox. In other words, to be both Greek and Orthodox at the same time. So they're playing more the religious ethnicity card.
Mhm.
Um, so there's that tension. There is that tension of like, no, we support democracy, but you know, Yeah, well, that's exactly it. But we support democracy.
But yeah,
But
trying to preserve some sort of
that gets them into all kinds of contradictions.
yeah. Now, so in the book, though, you have your main thesis is about theosis
Yeah.
and how this plays into why orthodoxy should or is compatible with democracy, and this is a path towards a non-radical form of orthodoxy. Can you explain theosis and
Yeah.
how you think this
So,
relates to the conversation?
yeah, I mean, so again, I mean, my position is that if we don't look at history, but look at our core theological beliefs, the things that really, if we were to take out of the equation, would make us stop being orthodox to some extent, right? And one of the things that is very key to the Orthodox world and to other Christian worlds too is this idea of deification, which is very, to some extent, it's one of those uh, common ground things that we might have with paganism, even though we might think of it differently.
Yeah, with kenosis.
Right. So the deification is this idea that um, Athanasius put it best when he says God became human so that humans can become God. So what does becoming God mean? Well, in the Christian tradition, if God is love, and that is the primary name that Christians give to God, then becoming God is to love the world, to love people as God loves the world. And God's love is unconditional no matter what we do. I mean, it doesn't mean we're off the hook for things that we do to other people and things like that. There is justice, but there is also the goal really is, in some sense, to mold ourselves into to mold ourselves into becoming the kinds of human beings that are able to increase their capacity for love.
Yeah, then this would be an area I think of common ground between the Orthodox and the polytheistic camp of things, because we do have the idea of trying to become like God, and so in as much as our power as possible. This goes back to Plato, the practicing of virtues to try to
Right.
cultivate the soul, to
Right.
elevate ourselves. So there is commonality here.
Yeah.
There are differences, obviously, but I think the focus should be on the commonalities right now, because I think what you have to say could is reason for me to reflect and pause to see how this could be. Does it translate into my world? Is it a one-for-one comparison? Is it, does it need to be tweaked a little bit? Does it make sense with kenosis and with theosis? These are things that I'm thinking about.
Yeah, because I think well, in the Orthodox world, though, what you have is this interesting thing where when you think about theosis, you think about it only in the monasteries.
Hmm.
And often the monasteries are seen as these places away from the political world.
Hmm.
And so the monasteries are the place of theosis, and the political world is kind of like this, messed up place that we don't really, that's
Yeah,
not,
they go to the monastery to get away from all that.
yeah, that's not the sphere of theosis. And I think the thing
Yeah.
that I'm trying to do is say that no, like, that would mean that if you're just a normal Orthodox Christian, you you couldn't become deified. And I don't think that's true. I mean, I think the whole world is, in my book, as you know, I say it like politics is the desert where we encounter where we encounter the temptation to demonize the stranger. And it's really true in many ways. In the political field, there's, look, monasteries aren't perfect, but at least everybody shares the same, belief system, rule of practice and everything.
Everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, they may not get along with each other. I mean, that's the struggle. But here, we're actually facing people that don't believe in it, the same thing we do. That we really have to face, the stranger. And and Jesus says to love, enemy and stranger. So to love God, to love as God loves in the world is to love enemy and stranger, which is very, very difficult. I'm not trying to minimize how difficult it is.
Hmm.
So in some sense, then this whole world that we live in is a space in which we work that theosis thing out, right? We it becomes an opportunity for us to engage in the kinds of practices that we can improve our relationships with God and with others. And I think politics, quite honestly, I think politics is, and I don't think anybody in the Orthodox Christian has ever said this before. I think politics is an ascetical practice to engage in your community, to argue with people, to volunteer, to respect other people's opinions, to respect pluralism. That's all ascetical in my mind, and it's an
What
kind
way?
of,
Can you explain?
well, yeah. I mean, asceticism is it's not simply a self-denial in the sense like, oh, I can't have lamb or things like that, although that's kind of part of it. I mean, everything is ascetical, right? I mean, the going to the gym is ascetical, right? You sort of deny yourself, you're aware. Asceticism to me is a kind of an awareness of the kinds of things that you're practicing and doing so as to form yourself in a particular kind of way and form your relationships in a particular kind of way. And I think going to the gym is a form of asceticism, where we think about the kinds of relational impacts that the kinds of actions we do when going to the gym, which may entail also denying ourselves like certain kinds of foods or whatever, is or drinking certain kinds of smoothies or whatever is a kind of an ascetical practice because we're kind of forming ourselves in ways for a certain kind of relational impact. And I think politics is that. I mean, I think asceticism isn't just about prayer and fasting and all that, although it obviously doesn't entail those things in the Orthodox Church, but it's also like really, really thinking about the ways in which I'm going to, work on myself and relate to others in such a way that, I just can't have everything I want, right? And I'm not going to murder someone so that somehow this particular political thing can get passed. Although some people do things like that, but
Yeah.
it's more about how I'm engaging with difference in the political sphere. That is,
Yeah.
it's how I'm engaging in difference and how my engaging with difference is an opportunity to work on myself and my relationship with God. So asceticism in the Christian sense has something to do with working on our relationship with God. And I don't think there's a sphere anywhere that is sort of where I don't think there's a sphere anywhere in which that ascetical practice can't be practiced.
Hmm. It's all about
That
scale.
is, yeah, that asceticism can't be practiced, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm going to my work or whether I'm at the gym or whether I'm at church or whether I'm in my family or walking into
Yeah.
my
So it's
dog.
pervasive throughout, all of human experience.
It has to be because it has to do with our relationship with God, and our relationship with God is pervasive in everything that we do.
Hmm. Now, what is the opposition to this point of view of theosis? Because now it's a theological concept, and everyone has their own views on theology. This is your understanding and presentation of theosis. Now, what is the historical or the counter narrative concerning theosis that supports the other side? What's the opposition saying?
No, no one's opposed to theosis. I think people are.
How they apply it and how are they
I
applying
think
it? That's
they're
the
opposed to the
way.
way in which I'm using it to support liberal democratic norms because they, one guy accused me of making theosis worldly or something like that, and well, I mean, he criticized me for that, but I don't think that that's necessarily wrong because I am trying to mundanicize theosis.
Yeah, well, we live in the mundane.
Well, I'm trying to see that theosis in the mundane,
Yeah.
and to me, you don't have to be like a theologian or a monk to see virtuous living or even holy living, and there's plenty of examples of Christians. Throughout the centuries, who don't get recognized as saints, but ultimately applied that way of living in their life in the village or wherever they did. I could think of my grandmother and so many other people. And so it's clear that even in mundane living that one can spot what I would call
Mhm.
a theotic way of being in the world, because sure, their mundane living may have to be with just cooking and cleaning, or doing kind of mundane jobs around the house or whatever, but they do them in a kind of way where they're relating both to the world, to themselves, to others, and to God, and again in a way that I would call theotic. And
Mhm.
so we have to stop thinking about the theosis as this domain of the monks or of the
Yeah,
monastic.
or something you do on Sunday. Like
Right,
it's
right.
not
That you
not
just
something
yeah,
in the sphere of the sacred. It's also the sphere of the mundane
right.
and the
That's
in the
exactly
profane,
that's
the
exactly
profane world.
that's exactly right. And if it's the world of mundane, then we have to think about then
How do you apply it?
what we really have to think about is what implications it has for our engagement in politics.
Hmm.
And some people, are like, well, what do I get? I get things like, oh, well, Chrysostom or St. John of Kronstadt hated democracy. So that's basically an argument that says these saints say it's bad, so we can't do it. And, that's kind of I get the logic of it, but nobody in the history of Orthodox Christianity ever argued that way, right? Athanasius, Basil, all those great figures never argued that way. They never said, Paul didn't say this. I mean, they drew on the scriptures and everything, but they never argued in that particular kind of way. And so that doesn't really make any sense to me.
Did any of them challenge the empire and the emperor?
I don't think it was within their frame of reference to challenge the structure of the empire, because one of the things they were for was for order, and I think that they saw government giving order at the time. But I they did challenge the we call it wealth gap, I guess. At the time, they definitely did challenge the way in which the poor were being treated in the empire,
Yeah,
poor and the marginalized. There's all kinds of evidence for that.
kind of like today.
Yeah.
A
Yeah,
lot of parallels.
there's all kinds of textual evidence for that. So they did
Yeah.
challenge, and they did stand up to emperors. Some of them did stand up to emperors. Chrysostom did, and Maximus the Confessor did, and so many other Basil did, and so many other ones did too. So they did stand up to emperors. They did,
Mhm.
and they got they suffered for it. Many of them suffered for it too.
So now within the diaspora, I want let's try to bring this conversation, I guess, to the diaspora and maybe the Greek American communities in the United States. What could be something they need to know or be aware of? How can we educate them on these issues? Because I've seen in my experience the Greek communities are going right wing and certain things, and they like the idea of Christianity having some sort of privilege in society. I've kind of seen that to a certain extent. I don't know if that's something you've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the issue with the church. I mean, one of the church thing the church is afraid of is that if they press democratic pluralism too much, is that they're going to lose their own privileges within the society. And I don't think they're necessarily wrong with that, honestly. I mean, but that's the risk you have to take. I mean, if you're going to be true to your principles, that's the risk you have to take.
Yeah,
But I think in terms of a broader educational kind of I don't know. It's really difficult because right now, I mean, you have the idea that in order to be Christian, there's a certain caricature. You must be against this or that, and it's even extending to vaccines in America and even in Greece. I mean, there's this phrase to be tis ecclesias, to be of the church, right? There's a certain type, a caricature of that, right?
yeah,
You can't be of the church and, like, I don't know, go to a bar. I mean, it seems weird. And that's so I just think that it's difficult to cut through these caricatures, right? To cut through these
yeah,
caricatures and to get people to realize that there's a lot of different ways that people can be Orthodox, right? There's a lot of different ways that I just think you can be a faithful Orthodox Christian and have questions about the church's position, let's say, on homoerotic um, uh, relations, and especially those that are uh, virtuous and monogamous, and so I think that I think you can be a good Orthodox Christian and see the wisdom of having ordained women as
Mhm.
and as priests.
Yeah. Now, authoritarianism, like how do we show people the signs of what they should be worried about? Like I like sharing this story, particularly with my uncle. Now I remember, because this is something I think that the Orthodox don't understand, is that the things they see around them in the society might look like it's for you, but it's not for you. You're not the audience.
Right.
And this goes for a lot of things that might be Greek, Hellenism, gets appropriated, for example. Things are used, like, look, like Disney's Hercules or whatever, like that's been appropriated, they turn into something else, and it's like the Greeks will look at that, it's like, well, it doesn't really relate to the real myth. It doesn't they things get shaped, and what I mean, like they transform for the audience. Now, bringing it to the politics and religion, I remember this was during the Trump years, and my uncle was watching TV, and Melania was giving, she was saying the Lord's Prayer at a rally. I don't know if you ever saw it, but he's sitting there and going, "Oh, I like to see my religion represented here."
Right. Right.
And I said to him, "This isn't your religion being represented to you, because the audience there is likely all, like, evangelicals or whatnot, and they're, what they signal to each other, what they are trying to tell them or promote, is very different than what you might want to promote and what you might see as acceptable, and you might fall into the trap of supporting a you might support policies and individuals because you see them as Christian, as one of you, but in the end they're going to persecute you in the end, because they see you as a heretic, that you're an Orthodox, you're Catholic, you guys are actually following false religion, and all that sort of thing." And he didn't quite get it until he saw, during the election, there were people outside of Arizona, some facility where the votes were counting, and they were on the floor praying for Trump to win, and going crazy at the doors. And he's like, "What is that?" I go, "That's the Christianity of this country." He goes, "Those aren't
Right. Right.
Christians."
Right.
I'm like, "No, those are Christians, and those were the people that they were talking to at the rally when they were saying the prayer." I go, "You're not the audience."
Yeah.
So it's these sorts of things that, like, how do we really teach people or educate people on these nuances?
I don't know, because the world is so polarized that I mean, I think at our center, the Orthodox Christian Studies Center, Public Orthodoxy, we try to offer a different kind of voice. And we try to offer it, we're not under any illusion that we're going to convince people sort of that are have a little bit more of a fundamentalist take on Orthodoxy, let's call it.
Mhm.
But so, but it's become so polarized that people are just kind of reading things that they want to read, and they're not really reading, counter views or counterpoints carefully. I think the only way to do it is to have those kind of one-to-one conversations, but I don't know how you scale up those one-to-one conversations, quite honestly. I really don't know how do you do that. I mean, but having those one-to-one conversations with people to just get them to see certain kinds of things, because you are exactly right. So Orthodox Christians may think now that they have common cause with other Christians, but let's say that Christianity becomes the norm again in the United States, and the culturally sort of the culturally dominant norm in the United States, then there are going to be certain kinds of Christians who are then going to say, well, it has to be this kind of Christianity.
Exactly.
And so it's everybody talks about slippery slopes in all kinds of different ways, right? If we do
Mhm.
this, like I remember on the gay marriage debate, well, if you allow gay marriage, we're going to have polygamy and this and that and whatever, and and all these slippery slope kind of arguments, right? Well, it can go the other way too, in the sense that what people don't realize is that if if you you might allow, you might see common cause and have allies in this particular what kind of way, but history has also shown us that your one-time ally could then turn on you, like, very
Yeah,
quickly,
especially
very, very quickly. Yeah.
the demographics. There's not a lot of Orthodox in the United States. There's the Orthodox, they rank. I forgot the ranking for them in the United States, but it's low. It's
Oh,
like,
we're like 0.5%.
Yeah, so it's a very small minority in this country, and supporting um, for example, like I see within Catholicism, there's an alignment with Catholicism with evangelicalism
Right, right.
just on many things. So it's like, well, is the what is the Orthodox Church going to do about that? I feel it seems from what I see from what the Greek Orthodox Church in the United States is more left leaning, I would say, moderate to left.
Than the other Orthodox churches for sure.
Yeah,
Not
yeah.
necessarily in the parishes, because I think it depends what parish you go to. But yeah, I mean, but I think our churches have more of a mix. They really do, and in some sense that should be seen as a, in some sense that should be seen as a as not a victory. That's not really not the word, an accomplishment. Um, there is
Mhm.
um, there is a sense in which most of our parishes have Democrats and Republicans in there, uh,
Mhm.
within the parishes, and they sort of, they sort of put aside, as they say, we say in our own liturgy that, at the cherubic hymn, let us put aside all the cares of this life. To some extent, they're kind of able to do that in the liturgy, although I don't think there's complete success, because I do think some people strongly advocate for one political position or another. But there are, I do think, within our parishes we haven't quite gone hard right, and I think that there are other jurisdictions where you see that kind of move happening, in a way
Mhm.
that it's very difficult to. Again, it's there's a vibe in which those parishes are identify much more with hard right politics. But even there are exceptions. I mean, even within those other communities, within those other jurisdictions, there are exceptions.
Mhm. Okay. Is there anything that you want to cover that you think might be important?
No, except that, just to get, I mean, assuming that many of your listeners are Greek listeners that aren't Orthodox, but I'm sure you have Greek listeners who are Orthodox, but assume that
Yeah.
it's just that, try to not caricature Orthodoxy as this sort of, monolithic, backward, um, religion that somehow is against democratic norms and against women, against, that is inherently homophobic or sexist or patriarchal, or these
Mhm.
things. I just don't. There are many of us in that world that are trying to show that it could be otherwise. Now, whether we,
How does it actually happen now?
yeah,
Like, how does it actually
yeah, whether we
implement?
gain steam or not in order to change the institutional structures, I don't know. But I do know there are people who have reached out to me and say, look, I am in my parish, and there is this small clique that is giving me this vibe. It's not everybody, but there's a small clique, and it's really upsetting. And I have certain views, but I love my church, right? And I don't want to leave it. And I just tell them, like, look, I mean, there are other people who think like you, and there is a community of people out there, for you. And, one of the hard parts is to find a community that you can feel is not going to be so judgy. And they exist out there, as we kind of talked about,
Yeah.
especially in the Greek Orthodox world. Um, but online, it's one of the advantages of online, is that you can find much more easily now Orthodox Christians who, feel that they try to be faithful Orthodox Christians, but yet, also feel, based on the theology and even the history, that, things, we can think about things differently. And, so I would just say, just try not to fall trap to caricatures about Orthodoxy, but quite honestly, just caricatures in general, because I think
Mhm.
caricatures keep us from finding the kind of common ground that, I think that your program and what you personally are trying to
Yeah.
forge.
Yes. As a theologian outside the church, now what challenges is that posed to you? How do you get your ideas really kind of
Yeah,
implemented or thought about? Like, who's the audience? Because if like what you're saying is not being taught in seminary,
no,
let's say at Holy Cross in Massachusetts, for example, if it's not being taught to the coming priests into the church, if it's not in the discourse in the
yeah,
church, and it's here in the domain of, the school and the university. How does that bridge get gapped?
Well, first of all, I know people at Holy Cross, and I can tell you that my ideas are being exposed to the students.
Mhm.
Now, whether the students agree or not is another story. Uh,
I tried looking up the curriculum over there, and I really couldn't find any syllabus
yeah,
for
no,
any of the
they
course.
there are courses in ethics and dogmatics and
Okay.
other things. So my idea,
Yeah, I couldn't get the details, so I really
yeah,
I
they're
couldn't
being
make.
exposed. So, but no, you're right though. It could be the case that they wouldn't be. It might be the case that they wouldn't be, but they are being exposed to my ideas.
Okay, good.
Um, Now it's up to them to decide whether they agree or not. I know that like we have this center at Fordham, which is the way in which we're trying to disseminate that kind of knowledge. And I think we have various kinds of audiences. We have a Christian theological one where I think we're fairly well known. We have an academic one, which especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've become much more well known. I was on the Brian Lehrer show, for example, and George, my colleague, was on BBC. I mean, things like that have been happening with us. And then we have the church audience, which I think we're I don't know if we're still a common household name, let's put it that way, but we're slowly sort of seeping into the church world. I do think a lot of priests love us and support us, and they're happy. I know there's a lot of bishops who have told us privately that they're very happy that we're raising these issues because it's difficult for them to raise them in their parishes and their dioceses or their metropolises.
Yeah.
There's no question that there are a lot of priests who are moderately worried about us, so they don't really tell their parishioners about us. And then there are definitely priests who just outright hate us. Uh,
They call you heretical?
yeah, more. I mean,
Hmm.
look, I mean, some softly call us liberal, and they're just like we're too liberal, so that's not. But others who are, um, I mean, others who really don't like us, I mean, just call us heretics and going to hell and all kinds of stuff. So we get a lot of that.
Lovely.
But we try to, we just look. I think honestly, our main audience really are people who want to see these things at least discussed in the church,
Hmm.
and B, are about to just call it quits, but then see that there's another Orthodox voice or presence and feel then that they don't have to call it quits.
Hmm.
And we're independent. We're not under any church organization or jurisdictions. We're totally independent, and it allows us to do programming like we're going to do on October 13th, where we're going to have a half day sort of seminar conference gathering. And it's called Seeking Harmony and Compassion, Pastoral Care, and LGBTQ plus Orthodox Faithfuls, who are we're inviting, it's not really academic, we're inviting LGBTQ plus Orthodox faithful to come and just simply talk about their experience within the church.
Where is this? At
That's at
the
Fordham Lincoln Center.
Okay.
It's on October 13th from 1 to 5:30 or so. Uh,
Oh, very nice.
it's on our website in Public Orthodoxy. There's an events page and you can find it there. And so, you know, we're a space where at the very least people just want to be heard,
Hmm.
and in ways that they can't really be heard elsewhere,
Yeah.
and to feel that maybe orthodoxy can to feel that they don't have to necessarily completely break their connection with orthodoxy in order to think and feel a certain kind of way. And yeah, I think we're very unique in the world, and I hope that we're working hard to raise money so we can continue to be that kind of space for people even after George and I are retired and gone. So
Very good. Well, I appreciate all the work that you're doing,
you,
as a
yeah,
polytheist. I do appreciate anything that anyone can do that's, forging, positivity
yeah.
and harmony in society. This is, I think, what we all should be striving for, um, you know, having a good functioning world. And I really do appreciate you taking out time to come onto the podcast to share your thoughts and ideas.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you for inviting me.